Depending on the level of detail you're working on for your risk management plan, the first thing you want to do is profile out the risks and answer some questions. Things about technical requirements, design, testing. Answering these questions, these hard, fast, challenging questions, help the risk management team come up with an appropriate risk management plan. Here's an example of putting some numbers in a semi-quantitative way of getting an idea on which risks need the most amount of management. Here we're looking at the classic examples of cost, time, and scope. We split out quality there because it's a separate issue in this particular example. And then we assign a number. Low risks get a low number, high risks get a high number, and we split it up into some relative values, and then assign a specific criteria for the scale that we've given. So in the example of costs, we'll rank something a 2 if it's less than 10% above originally planned cost, and so on. Again, using the increments that make sense for your particular project. We can take this to the next level, and if we can identify things like likelihood, impact, and detection difficulty, we can actually come up with a reasonably good plan on which particular risks we want to manage. And so we can give a scale or a range to the likelihood of an event occurring. Then we can also give a scale or range to the impact if that event does occur, and looking at how easy it will be to know whether that event has happened with the detection difficulty. And in this failure mode and effect analysis, FMEA, we just multiply the values, the impact times the probability times the detection, and we get a risk value. And then obviously the ones with the higher number we need to manage and have more plans in place if those things happen, and the ones with the lower value we can probably address in some easier way. If we take the values that we got from our FMEA results and we plot them along this in the severity matrix, we can see that those types of risk events that come up in our red zone will identify as major risks. Those that appear in the pinkish zone will have our moderate risk identified with it, and those that wind up in the green zone will considered minor risks, and we'll set up plans accordingly. After we've done a risk assessment of the various risk events, now we got to figure out a way to respond to those events as they may occur. And really we have 4 choices. We can mitigate the risk or reduce the likelihood that it might happen. Or if it does happen, reduce the impact. We can avoid the risk completely, change the design, change part of the project plan to get rid of that risk. We can decide to transfer that risk. Maybe we take out some insurance against weather problems and weather delays in a construction project. Maybe we decide that it's something that if it's something that the owner of the project really wants, we decide that it's the owner's risk to take that on. And then maybe it's just the nature of the beast that even though there's a risk identified, I think that in the case of a demolition, I think one of the risks I think is clear is that maybe the thing doesn't demolish correctly, and so we retain that risk with a plan for to put in place if that risk event actually takes place. One of the risk responses is contingency plans, and having a plan to put in place once a risk event occurs is a good thing, because what happens normally when those events happen is that people are panicked and are challenged. And if you have a book or a manual you can go to tell you what to do instead of having to figure it out on the fly, that will then probably in the long run be cheaper and more effective than if you have no plan in place and the event does occur. You can see that if there's no plan, the managerial response will be slow while they're formulating a plan. And I think we all know that decisions made under pressure can be dangerous, they can be costly. You don't have to look any further to the recent example in the Gulf is not having a proper plan in place for the oil spill that occurred down there. Some specific risks and contingency plans that we should be specifically worried about or specifically address would be those technical risks, those strategies we have in place if we're depending on a technology, a new technology, and that technology fails. And within the technical risk mode, we should be able to assess whether those technical uncertainties can be resolved. If they can't be resolved, you should have another plan in place that doesn't use those technologies, or maybe consider whether that would be a point to cancel the project. Of course, we have to worry about schedule risk, always worrying about projects being late. Projects that are late cost resources, they cost time, they cost money. And so we have, from Chapter 6, learned that we can use Slack and manage the critical path, but at any point in time, that may not be good enough. And so we'll see some techniques when we get into Chapter 9 to speed up the process if we are running late on a project. But keep in mind that anytime we compress the project schedule to shorten up project time, we can actually reduce the risk of actually being late. And we'll see that more when we get into Chapter 9. Like all good project management practices, we'll set up some sort of a matrix that will identify what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and what our plan is. So in this case here, we developed a risk response matrix for this technology IT project, it looks like. And so we've identified the specific risk events, what our response is going to be. Again, we only have 4 choices of what we can do. In most of these cases, we're going to try and mitigate. What's our plan if the risk event occurs? What's going to be the trigger? How will we know if it's time to invoke the risk management plan? And ultimately, just like any other responsibility matrix, we've identified who's going to be responsible. Who do we go to when we have some problems with the interface, or we have user backlash issues, or equipment malfunctions? All these things are specified nicely within your risk response plan. In addition to time and technical risks, there are also cost risks. Cost risks take on a couple different flavors, and we're going to talk about how we handle various contingency funds to handle the cost risks. In addition to cost risks, maybe we have funding risks. It's quite possible within the SIM project you're running, you'll have a customer demand that causes you to lose funding on part of your project in order to reduce costs. It happens all the time. So those things that have an impact on the project, we should have a plan for. Within a project's funding, we should have contingency funds established. Funds to cover the project risks, both the identified and the unknowns. And the size of that fund might very well be reflected upon how big the project is. And we can think of contingency funds in 2 different ways. We can have funds for our budget that are linked to specific risks within the work package that have come up in the risk management plan. And then above and beyond that, we can have management reserves in place. There are large funds that cope for major unforeseen risks, like a change in a project scope, an unforeseen event such as a Katrina hurricane type event. So those types of things are above and beyond what you can manage and really go and get into the nitty-gritties of understanding how we can overcome those types of issues. So we have some factor that we apply for management reserves. Time buffers are used to allow for activities that might be delayed, and that those delays would actually cause the project schedule to be delayed. They're put on activities that have high risk, activities that merge into the critical path, non-critical activities that are near the critical path, and any particular project where scarce resources might cause the project task to be delayed. Here we have an example of a project budget that has budget reserves and management reserves in place. You can see that we have specific budget baseline values for things like design, code, and test. Since those things have a risk management plan associated with them, and we've identified certain risks that might cause us to need additional funding, we put budget reserves in place for those specific activities that we can tap into. And then we also put a management reserve in on the total project, so that those things that aren't addressed by the specific activities, that pop up in the course of doing the project can be funded through the management reserves. Risk management does take on sort of a negative connotation, and most of the management we talk about is managing around those events and things that occur. However, there are times within the course of a project where there might be opportunities that exist as a result of these events. We tend not to quantify them so much or have plans for them, but we should always be recognizing the possibility that these events may actually have a positive impact. So if those events are positive, we have some tactics we can use from our risk management standpoint to either exploit the particular event. Maybe we, as a result of something going on, we can share some resources. Maybe we can use that event as an opportunity to have a positive impact on the project. Or in some cases, go ahead and accept what's going on. Don't invoke or take on additional costs and just let it slide. And it might be an event that we don't have to worry about too much. The last step in the managing risk process is risk response control. Within risk control, we're going to execute the strategy. We're going to be monitoring for those events that might cause the risk management plan to be undertaken, initiate the plans as those risk events come up, and always watching for new risks. Within the risk response control is having a change management system for not only monitoring, tracking, and reporting risk, but also allowing for changes to the project, allowing for having this open dialogue. You know, in class we talk a lot about how there's always a culture of lack of trust. Having an open process here will bring up the trust factor and change corporate culture around. We use the change management control process not only to take care of all the events that have come up in the risk management plan, but also to allow for scope changes to the project, allow for those contingency plans to actually take place, because in many cases the project's going to change based on that plan implementation. And along the way there's always areas for improvement, and this change management control process allows for improvement changes to take place in a systematic way. This is a good example how a change control system process can work. We first identify whatever changes they are. If it's a change that's come out of a risk event, or a change identified by the customer, or a change identified by someone on the team, doesn't matter. No matter what those changes are, we should put the effect of the, if known, that what those proposed changes will be on the schedule and budget. If not known, we need some more work to do. We'll then have a process to go ahead and review and evaluate and have an approval process or disapproval process for the change in a formal way. If there's any issues from the change, cost, time, whatever, we negotiate those. We go ahead and communicate those changes to everyone affected, assign responsibility for implementing that change. Because it's been through this process, we can adjust our baseline budgets, the master schedule, so that we now are measured against these new things. And of course, we want to track those changes as well. Let's take a look at what this looks like graphically. So here's a graphical representation of the change control process. Whatever comes into play, we'll have a process for reviewing it, and if we don't approve it, send it back to the beginning. If we do approve it, we update all the records and actually get the work done. There's some significant benefits for having a process in place to allow for changes. The biggest one is not allowing for a lot of informal changes, and so we have to go ahead and go through a formal process for those changes. We can track the costs. We can have the impact on the WBS and any performance measures. We can then go ahead and manage the change through the use of budgeting and adding resources as needed. We can identify who's going to implement that change and let everyone know that's affected by it, that what's going on. Monitor the change, and then from that we can see that any changes to scope can be reflected in the baseline and performance measures, so that were being measured accurately against the project in its current state and not in the project as it was originally thought out before these changes took place.